Hello everyone, I'm Hosok Won. I help my customers deploy Identity Service Engine to secure their networks. And today I'm going to do something very interesting, which is installing the Identity Service Engine from scratch. Meaning I'm going to install the ISE on with a new ISO image onto a VM, configuring the VM to make sure that it's configured correctly. And then I'm going to configure the wireless controller and also the ISE policies and test out the endpoints to make sure that the guest access, employee access, and BYOD is working. So let's look at how the lab is set up. So kind of looking from the left, we have two SSIDs that's going to be configured. One is called Open. Mainly the use case for the Open SSID is for guest users. And also have an SSID called ISE. It's going to be used for employee users and single SSID BYOD onboarding. On the switch, I have matching VLANs for the SSIDs. So I have VLAN 30, that's for employees, VLAN 40 for the open SSID, and I also have VLAN 80 that's going to be used for AP management. I also have VLAN 201 and 202. 201 is going to be used for the ISE itself and the AD server that's also going to be doing DNS and DHCP. I also have VLAN 202 that's going to be the management network for wireless controller. So what are some of the use cases that we're testing today? So the main one is going to be around the admin users. So if you're a member of a domain admin group, it's going to let the user in without any restrictions. If it's a regular employee user, we're going to make the user go through the onboarding process. And then once the device has been onboarded, we're going to give it full access. And lastly, we'll have guest users. So guest users will go through the hotspot access. And once the user enters the passcode and accepts the AUP, the user will get internet-only access. So what are the higher-level configuration steps? So first one is the baseline network setup. This part is not something I'm going to go over in detail. My lab is already set up with the routing, DNS and DHCP server is already set up, and the AP discovery setting is already in place using the DHCP server. We are going to validate the configuration, but we are not going to set it up from scratch. And then we'll move on to the ISE setup. So this is about priming the VM for the ISE installation, and we'll make sure that the IP connectivity is there with the ISE. While the ISE is being installed, we're going to configure the wireless controller. So we're going to configure the radius servers, ACLs, that'll be used for guest users, and the redirect. And we'll also configure the two WLANs, one's open and the secured one called ISE. By the time that we're done with the wireless controller setup, the ISE should be back up. So we'll configure the best practices on it, such as setting up the policy set, adding it to the AD, and also some other settings related to the profiling. After that, we're going to move on to the actual policy setup. We are going to be creating two policy sets, one for the open SSID and the other one for the secure SSID. We're also going to configure the guest portals so that we can key in the passcode that's used for the hotspot. One other thing that you need to do is make sure that the controller is in the NAD list within the ISE, so we'll be doing that as well. And once that's done, we're going to test the endpoints to make sure that our policy is set up correctly. Okay, so this is my lab setup. So first I'll show you what the settings are on the AD server. So the AD name is example.com, and it's hosting the DHCP server and the DNS server that's needed for the ISE to function. For the DHCP, I have the VLAN 30 that's going to be used for employee users, and VLAN 40 that's going to be used for guest users. And I also have VLAN 80 that's going to be used for the AP discovery. So one of the settings that you need on the AP Discovery VLAN is that the AP needs to find where the controller is. So if you go to the scope options, I have a option 43, which is set up to a IP address of the controller in there. So it's in the hexadecimal format, but this allows the AP to find where the controllers are when it's booted up and gets an IP address. The other settings that you need is the DNS. So on the example.com DNS zone, I have the ISE 2.0 with the IP address already in there. I also configure the reverse lookup zone for the PTR so that when you ping the IP address, you can also get the name back. So the other things that I recommend if you're configuring the ISE is add in the host name for the My Devices and the sponsor portal. It can point to the same IP address as the ISE itself. So I have 192.168.201.88 for sponsor, My Devices, and the ISE 2.0 itself. Okay, so some of the other things that you need is the ISO file. I also have the patch file that you can install once the ISO has been installed. The reason I'm using the ISO file instead of the OBA is because it's more lightweight, and I want to kind of show you what other settings are needed to configure the VM correctly when you're using the ISO file. Now, I'm using a VMware Fusion here, but in case you're using the VMware ESXi or other flavor of the VMware server, the steps are very similar to what I'm doing here. So first I'm going to create a new VM. So I'm going to select the custom virtual machine, and on the Linux, you'll be selecting Linux as an option, and for the ISE 2.0, it's going to be Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6 64-bit. You're going to create a new virtual disk, and these default settings are not, it doesn't work for the ISE itself, so we are going to customize it to our needs. Okay, so I'm going to install it on the ISE folder here, and I'm going to name it ISE 2.0 install demo. Okay, so let's look at some of the settings that we need. So I'm going to go to each settings to make sure that they're all set up correctly. So processors, you need at least 4 cores for the ISE to install, and for the memory RAM, you need 4 gigabytes at minimum. So for a proof of concept and demo, this is enough. If you need to have a production environment, so obviously you need to increase it depending on your needs. So if you need to have more endpoints that's connecting, you may want to increase it to 16 cores, and also the RAM to be much higher, such as 32 gigabytes. There's other documentation that shows how to scale the VM, so I'm not going to go into detail about those. Network settings, I'm going to be using the Thunderbolt Ethernet in this case, because that's where the 201 subnet is. And the hard disk, I'm going to be giving it 200 gigabytes. 200 gigabyte is kind of the minimum here that you need to install the ISE. The good thing about ISE is that it supports thin provisioning, so it's not going to actually consume the 200 gigabytes on your hard drive unless it's really needed. I'm going to map this to the ISO image that I downloaded. Okay, so here's the ISO file. And I'm going to remove anything that I don't need. So sound card, I know I don't need. USB, I don't need either, so I'm going to remove that. Printer is something I don't need. So that looks pretty good. So at this point, I'm going to close this out, and let's get on with the ISE install. Okay, so I'm going to select the number 1, which is when you're using the keyboard and monitor. in the case of VM, that is if you're using the console, that's the option that you want. Okay, so it looks like it's moving pretty good. So the idea about this demo is to show you what the experience is like when you're installing the ISE from scratch. So I'm going to try my best not to skip any parts, but if it's going to be a part where we're just kind of waiting for the screen to refresh, I may kind of fast forward the video so that you don't have to just look at the screen kind of refreshing. At the same time, I'll try to squeeze in some other activities in between so that you're not just waiting on the screen to refresh as well. So in this case, I'm going to jump to the wireless controller settings and show you what we need to configure on the controller. And then hopefully once we come back, the ISE install will be progressed through where we can, it's waiting for our inputs. Okay, so I'll have the screen here so we can look at it while we're configuring the controller. Okay, perfect. So if you focus on the serial port here, so I have a wireless controller, the Cisco controller 2504. That's reset in terms of configuration. So I'm going to configure this controller to work with the ISE. So I'm going to terminate the auto install, and let's name it WLC-1, and admin name is going to be admin. Give it a good password. And no, I only have one interface, so I'm not going to use lag. Management IP address is going to be 202.61, net mask. Okay, actually I have trunking enabled on the interface that controller connects to the switch. So I'm going to be using tagging for the management interface. And I'm using the interface 1. The DHCP server is going to be the AD server, so it's going to be 72. And for the virtual gateway, I'm just going to give it 1111. And I'm not really going to be using that feature, but so I'm going to give a IP address for multicast, and also going to name the mobility group name as main. And this SSID is going to be used, the first SSID configures, and as a default, the controller is going to make it a secure SSID. So I'm going to name it ISE. Okay, and this is really optional. You can do bridging or proxying. It really doesn't matter. Both works with the ISE. In this case, I'm just going to use the DHCP proxying feature on the controller, so I'm going to say no here. And static IP address for the endpoints really doesn't matter. We are actually not going to be using static IP, but I'll just say yes for now. For the radius server, I'm just going to say no. I'm going to show you how to configure it on the GUI, so I'll just skip this. And once we get access to the GUI of the controller, we'll configure the radius server from there. Okay, the country code is US, I'm not going to be using 11B. I'm just going to do 11A. Sure, auto RF. Yes. I'm not going to be using IPv6. I'm going to say no. All right. So once the controller comes back on, there is one command that requires it to reload again. The command is called config network webauth captive portal bypass enable. So what that setting does is it disables the mini browser pop-up on the Apple devices. The reason that we need to disable the mini browser on the Apple device is because that browser is very limited in terms of what it can do. And part of our BYOD process requires some functionality on the browser that the mini browser cannot do. So that is why we're disabling the mini browser running that command. Okay, looks like the ISE itself is moving along pretty good in terms of the installation. And I also have the controller booting up. Okay, so I'm going to log in as admin user. Okay, so I'm going to run that command and reload the controller again. So as you can see, it says you must reset the system for this setting to take effect. So I'm going to save the configuration. So once the controller comes back online, we'll configure the rest of the settings such as WLANs and the radio server settings. Now, quick note about the command that I just ran, the capture portal bypass enable. If you have a deployment that you're just purely doing guest access, you may be able to do without that command. So for the simple guest access, we can leverage the mini browser, and it generally works okay with our central web auth. So if you're purely just doing the guest access without the BYOD, then you can try setting the controller up without enabling the capture portal bypass. So once the ISE node comes back online, I'm going to give it an IP address, set up the admin user. Okay, so it looks like the controller is back online, so I'm going to connect to it via GUI now. All right, perfect. So it looks like an IP is already associated. And at this point, I can go to the security and let's configure the radio server. So I'm going to add the IP address of the ISE. And this support for RFC 3576, this is what enables the change of authorization. So if you're installing the ISE with the controller, you definitely want to enable this. And the server timeout is, sorry, 2 is really short, so you want to increase it to 5 or higher. And unless you're doing it for management, you can uncheck the management, so it's only used for the users. And you also want to create the same accounting server with the same IP address. Again, increase the timeout to 5 seconds. We're also going to create the access control list. The first one is for the redirect ACL. So this is the name that's used on the default settings within the ISE, so you want to follow the same name. And I'm going to create a new rule that's going to be for ISE. Any traffic from the ISE is going to be permitted. Any traffic to ISE is also permitted. And minimally, you need to add the DNS so that when the user is trying to go to a home page such as Google, that also gets allowed. So I'm going to say UDP DNS is allowed. Oops. Okay, UDP. Did I do source with destination? Not sure. Okay, this is same, so let me modify this real quick. Any to DNS. All right, perfect. So in reality, if you are setting this up for production environment, you don't want to give a full IP access to the ISE. You can limit it to a few ports that ISE needs. If you're doing guest access, it's going to be 8443. If you're doing BYOD, there are some additional ports that you may need to allow. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to allow IP access so that I can show you the setup much quicker. Now I'm going to create an ACL for the internet users. So I'm going to name it internet only. And it's going to be my internal network is going to be 168.0.0. It's going to be deny. Okay, so anything that's going to 192.168.0.0 is going to be denied. Okay, so I need to modify this to be like that, right? Okay, and I need to allow DNS. So all right, and let's add a new rule that allows everything else. Okay, so hopefully this works for the limiting internal access but allowing DNS and the internet. So at this point, we need to configure the WLANs for guest users, right? Before we do that, let's go back to the ISE and see if it's waiting on anything from us. Okay, so let me do this first before I jump back to the controller. So setup ISE 2.0. No secondary. And for the NTP, I'm going to use a switch. going to set it up as a central time zone. And yes, I want to SSH. Okay, so it's going to test the network settings to make sure that we have the default gateway set up correctly and all that. And once it's done, it's going to prime the database and fully install the ISE. And then once it comes back online, we will have IP connectivity through the GUI to the server. So let's hop back to the wireless controller, and let's validate the first SSID is configured correctly. So here's the ISE SSID. Okay, so it's enabled. Okay. So it's using management interface. That means that we need to configure the other interfaces on the switch, on the controller. We haven't done that, so let's go back. And on the interfaces, okay. So I'm going to create and VLAN ID is going to be 30. Okay, and the port number is going to be 1. Okay, good. Looks good. Okay, I'm going to create one for open. Okay. Okay, looks good. So I got the employee interface and the open interface. Okay, so let's go back. So for the ISE SSID, we're going to use the employee interface, and it's using WPA WPA2, and we don't want any layer 3 security, but let's make sure that it's using the radius server that we had defined. Even if you don't select one, as long as it's enabled, it's going to select the ones already configured in the radius server list. But here we're just going to define them manually. And for the ISE to work on the controller running 8.0 and above, you want to make sure that the interim update is checked and the interval is set to 0. Okay, the other settings are going to be in the advanced. So you want to enable AAA override so that you can apply ACLs and redirect ACLs for the user. And you also want to make sure that the radius NAC is enabled. And for the purpose of profiling, you can enable the radius client profiling. And if you also want local profiling with the controller, you can also do that as well. Okay, so these are the settings that you want to enable. I'm going to click apply. Okay, now I'm going to create a new SSID called open. And this one is going to be enabled. Interface is going to be open. And we are going to be using no layer 2 security, but we are going to be using MAC filtering. Okay, same settings for the radius. And advanced. For the open SSID, you may want to disable the CHD here and the AeroNet IE. But the other settings are the same. You want to enable the radius NAC and also the profiling. Okay, so this is all set up. I'm going to save the config for the controller. And let's go back to the ISE. Okay, looks like it's installing. And once ISE node is up and running, we can go to the GUI of the ISE and then configure the rest of the ISE settings. Okay, so just in time, it's rebooting. By the way, once the ISE reloads, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes for all the services to come up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let the demo run, but I'm going to kind of fast forward so that you don't have to wait for the ISE install screen to come up. And here we go. Okay, so this is really nice, but even after you get the prompt for admin user, that does not necessarily mean that the service is up and running. So let me just quickly show you what is needed to confirm whether the ISE service is up and running or not. Okay, so it looks like it's still initializing. The application server is the one that you need to get the GUI. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, so it looks like the application server is up and running. So at this point, we can log on to the ISE GUI and then configure the rest of the ISE settings. Okay, so I'm going to open up. Okay, looks good. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to do some baseline configurations, such as adding the ISE to the AD, setting up the policy set, enabling the profiling. So let me go to the settings. Okay, so for profiling, I'm going to enable reauth. I'm also going to enable the attribute filter. So attribute filter is what controls what attribute gets replicated between the ISE nodes. This is a single deployment, so you don't really have to, but this is going to be the best practice if you have a distributed deployment. Okay, and I'm going to enable the policy set. This will make me disconnect from the window and make me re-log in. Okay, so let's add the ISE to the AD. So it's going to be the external identity sources. Okay, and Active Directory, add. Yes, let's go ahead and join this. Okay, so the AD has been joined, and this one only has one domain within the forest, so it's going to be one. If you have multiple domains within a forest, you may want to select the ones that's going to be used for authentication, so that's much quicker in terms of finding the user. But in this case, I only have one domain, so I'm going to leave it as default. I'm going to add some groups that I'll be using in the policy. Okay, so the two groups that I'll be using is the domain users and the domain admins. So here's the domain users, or domain admins and domain users. And I'm going to click on save. Okay, at this point I can add the network device. Okay, so the network device has been added, and I'm going to configure the guest portal so that we can configure the password for the guest settings. So here I'm going to be using the Hotspot guest portal. Okay, so here I'm going to make it provide a password. It's going to be Cisco 123. Okay, that looks good. So when they connect to the Hotspot portal, they'll get an AUP along with a passcode. Once they provide a passcode, they'll be redirected to a success page. Okay, now let's move on to creating the actual policies. Okay, so this one is going to be the SSID open. And to match against an SSID, you want to look up the radius attribute called called station ID. This depends on many. It depends on the vendors. But in the case of Cisco controllers, it sends the SSID name in the called station ID field, and it's kind of combination of the AP name, AP interface MAC, and the SSID name. So you want to set this as ends with open. So this will match against the open SSID. And since this is for guest users, you want to map it against the internal endpoints. And since there can be unknown devices, I'm setting the policy to continue when there's unknown user. Okay, so I'm going to configure this to be Cisco WebAuth. And I'm going to configure a rule above that says guest endpoints. So whenever endpoint goes through guest portal, it's going to be added to the guest endpoints group, and then I'm going to give it a access. Okay, I forgot to create the policies, but I'm just going to say permit access for now, and we'll come back to modify it to secure it a little bit more. Okay, and I'm going to create a new one above. Okay, this one is going to be the SSID ISE. In this case, instead of internal users, we're going to be the all user ID stores. In this case, you want to reject if the user is not found for security reasons. And here, if the user falls back to the default rule, we want to go through the NSP onboarding process. Once the NSP onboarding is successful, that means that the endpoint has been registered, and hopefully they're using a EPTLS as the network access method. So we'll do that, and then you have full network access. Okay, so we need to create a new one for the admin users, right? So we're going to say admin users. If you are part of the AD group called domain admins, you don't have to go through the NSC onboarding, where it's going to allow you in without any restrictions. Okay, so let me go back and make sure that I have the results here configured correctly. So authorization. Okay, so the Cisco WebAuth, let's make sure that it's set up as the hotspot. Okay, so it's set as the self-registered guest portal, but so let's change that to use the hotspot that we created or we modified. So I'm going to use a default. Okay, and save. Okay, so here is the one configured for hotspot, and let's see. I'm going to create a new one for internet-only access. Okay, so enter that. Okay, go back to the policy. And let's review what the policy looks like. So here I have the OpenSSID settings. So if you come in and if we find out that you're not a member of the guest endpoints group because you haven't been connected before or your MAC address is not in the guest endpoints list, then that means that you'll get the Cisco WebAuth. This is going to redirect the user to hotspot portal. If the user gets into the guest endpoints group, then the guest endpoints device will get into the permit access. Now, we can change that to the one that we created right before, which is internet-only access as well. I'll just leave it as permit access for now, just for testing. Okay, now going to the Cisco ISE SSID. Here, if the user comes in and it's not part of the domain admin group, it will fall back. And if we find out the MAC address isn't something that's in the registered device group, it's going to fall into the NSP onboarding group, which means that it's going to get onboarded and get a certificate pushed down to the endpoint. Once the certificate has been pushed down to the endpoint, it's going to be configured to use that certificate for the network access. And that is when the endpoint can connect using the registered network access here, where device will get full network access. So at this point, let's see if we can connect the endpoint and test out all the settings that we have created. Okay, so here I have a test endpoint. So I'm just going to test out the first use case, which is guest access. So let's associate to the SSID here. Okay, so let's connect to the OpenSSID. Okay, so I have the 40 address. That means I'm on the correct subnet. And at this point, I'm going to, okay. Okay, so I'm in the hotspot portal. It's asking for access code. So I'm going to enter in the, okay, perfect. So I can go back to the Apple. And in this case, I have network access. Okay, so that worked. I'm going to disconnect this endpoint from the SSID. Okay, so one of the things that you need to do when you're testing with one endpoint for different use cases is that you have to make sure that the endpoints are truly disconnected from the controller. So if you go back to the clients, you see that this endpoint is still connected as into the OpenSSID. So you need to come here, remove, and make sure that it's no longer connected. Okay, and the other thing that you need to do on the ISE is that this endpoint has been registered as a guest endpoint, right? So what you need to do is go to the identities and make sure that this device is removed from the database before you continue on with the other testing. This is something that many engineers forget, and they get some odd results when they're testing with a single endpoint. So I want to make sure that you know how to clear these settings on the controller and the ISE. Okay, so this time we're going to configure the or connect as a domain admin user and see if we can get network access without getting redirected to the BYOD. Okay, so I'm going to connect to the ISE. Okay, so I have 30 that address, so I'm good. So hopefully I don't get redirected here when I try to go to, let's see, Disney. Okay, perfect. So I'm not getting redirected. So let's review the live log real quick to make sure that everything is good. So, there must be some kind of a test thing going on. So let me just filter out by anything that includes the MAC address. Okay, much easier to see now, right? So you have to kind of look at this from the bottom up. So when we connected as a guest endpoint, it was getting a Cisco WebAuth policy, right? So what that means is that the user was stuck on the hotspot portal, but once the user provided a proper credentials, these green lines indicates the change of authorization. One probably for the profiling because it found out that it was an Apple iPhone, so it wanted to make sure that it's on the proper network. So that's happened once, and the second one is because the user authenticated by providing the good passcode and the accepting the AUP. So once that was done, the endpoint guest user had the permit access and was able to go to the apple.com site. So again, when we connect to the different SSID, which was this SSID ISE with the admin user, the user was permit accessed, and again, the change of authorization, this blank line happens because it was first time the endpoint was seen on the ISE side, and ISE sends a change of authorization because that's how we set it up in the profiling settings. And then once it was in, we get permit access. Okay, so this time I'm going to connect to the same SSID, but with a employee username instead of a admin username, and see if we can get redirected and go through the BYOD process. So again, before you do that, make sure that you go to identities and remove the MAC address. So I'm going to do the same thing on the endpoint. I'm going to forget this and go to the WLC and remove the user. Okay. And lastly, you want to remove the endpoint from here. Okay, so by the way, there's a reason that I stepped through with the endpoint first, and then the controller, and then the ISE. The thing is, if you don't disconnect the endpoint from the SSID first, it's going to reattach or reassociate to the SSID, and you'll end up with the MAC address populating into the ISE again as soon as you remove it. So that is why I recommend deleting the Wi-Fi settings on the endpoint itself first, and then remove the session from the controller, and then remove the MAC address from the ISE. So this only really happens when you have only one device that's you are testing with for multiple use cases. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to connect as a employee user. Hopefully I remember the user ID on this one, but we'll give it a try. Okay. Okay, looks like I got the good IP address here. So this time I want to make sure that I'm getting redirected. So let me open up the browser. Okay, I'm going to go to, let's see, go back to Apple. Okay, so it looks like I'm getting redirected to the BYOD portal in this case because I'm using a regular employee user ID instead of the admin user ID on the AD. So I'm going to click on Start. Okay. So what it's doing is it's generating the certificate on the phone itself, sending it back to the ISE, and the ISE is going to sign it and send it back to the endpoint. And the endpoint is going to be configured with the Wi-Fi settings to connect back to the ISE SSID using the certificate that was just signed. Okay, so it says it's successful. So what I can do is go to the apple.com website, and as you can see, I can browse the internet, and just to show you what the setting looks like. So these are the profiles that's been installed on the phone itself. So this is for the actual certificate of the ISE, and this is the settings. So there's the Wi-Fi settings, SSID name, encryption, and there's the certificate that's been issued to this endpoint. So the common name is going to be my user ID, and I haven't configured anything for the OU or other attributes in the certificate, so it's showing some of the basic settings in there. Okay, so I hope it was useful. This is kind of basically how you configure the ISE with the Cisco wireless controller. I'm going to show you some screens that has the resources that you can get. So if you go to product page, you can get all the links that you need for the ISE. There's also a public community page that you can get to for any support. If you are a partner, there's also a partner related page for ISE as well. So if you have any sales related questions, and that's where you want to put in. If it's any questions about the technology, I recommend putting into the public community forum. These two forums are maintained by our TME team within the ISE. team, and we tried our best to respond as soon as possible. There's also other documentation such as compatibility matrix to make sure that the network components and the operating system are compatible with the ISE. There's also many design guides and how-to guides that you can get. And if you are a partner and if you want to know how to order ISE, you can go to this file. And there's also a tool that you can get to find out how many licenses for ISE nodes and endpoints are needed. And there's also what's called an ISE portal builder that you can log in to create a really nice looking guest portals, BYOD portals for your ISE deployments. All right, with that, thank you very much for listening and watching my video.